Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We are once again joined by our guest host, Melissa Harris, who is our advanced profiling coach here at Personality Hacker. Melissa, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And the reason why we invited you to come on today is because of a conversation you and I were having when we were talking about teaching conversational profiling to students. One of the challenges we see coming up over and over again is the difference between the theory of the relationship that we have with our cognitive function stack, or what we call the CAR model, the cognitive functions that are the driver, the co-pilot, the 10-year-old, and the 3-year-old, versus the reality of our relationship with those functions. Because the theory makes it sound like whatever is the strongest function will be the loudest, but the reality is a little different. So we thought that for the sake of people who are still trying to figure out their best fit type, doing a little bit of self-analyzing, that we would have a conversation around that and talk about the difference between the theory and the reality of how this all shows up.
Just to give you a note, if you're maybe a new listener, we're going to jump right into this today. And so if you're like, what are you guys talking about? The CAR model, what is that? Well, we have a lot of information and resource over at personalityhacker.com. Just search the CAR model. It's a great framework to understand where we're coming from today, and you might want to listen to that first before you listen to this episode and this conversation. And you know, Antonia, as you're saying this, I'm reminded of our daughter who's in karate right now, she's taking karate and she wants me to practice moves with her. She's like, Dad, attack me this way. And so I try to attack her and I change it. She's like, no, you're not attacking me the way I've been trained to defend you. You have to attack me the way I was trained. She's leaning on the theory of it, but she's trying to connect it to the practice. And the practice is much different than how she learned to defend. And she's young still. She's only 8 at the time of this recording. So she's still trying to figure this out, right? The reality doesn't match the training because she hasn't had enough practice yet. And I think this is a good metaphor, a good example, I think, of what happens in profiling. We have a theory or what we think will happen with people's function stack, but the reality is very different. And we can't expect them to behave in the way that we think they should behave. Like that type should behave, quote unquote.
Yeah. So what's really nice is to have a little bit of a deeper dive beyond just the theory and talk about how these things are actually, how we're actually experiencing them. So if you do know your best fit type, you, the listener, we're not going to go through every cognitive function in the CAR model or the cognitive function stack. So you'll have to keep in mind, if you do know your best fit type, you'll have to keep in mind your functions. But if you hear the practicality of it and it doesn't match your experience with that type, we will talk about some of the contexts in which it might show up a little bit differently for you. But if you have maybe a disconnect between the reality of how these oftentimes show up and how you're experiencing them, that might be some food for thought. It might be a moment to reevaluate, maybe I'm using this cognitive function, but maybe I'm using it slightly differently than I thought before. Maybe it's a different position in my CAR model. So there are definitely exceptions to everything. There are no rules, there are trends, but we'll talk about the trends of how these different positions generally surface. So, all right. So without any more preamble, let's start with the driver function. And the theory behind, or in theory rather, or the theoretical approach, is that driver or dominant function should be the most obvious. It should be the loudest. It should just be emanating from our pores because it's such a big part of our experience. But Melissa, you were talking about having profiled like literally over 1,000 people, that in the early days, that's what it looked like it should be for, to you as well. Like it should be real obvious. But what have you actually found as you have profiled so many different people? What's their actual real relationship with that driver function?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's definitely something that I misunderstood when I started profiling. I almost never in a profiling session hear somebody spell out their driver function. They usually are so immersed in it and so comfortable and confident in it that it almost just doesn't come up. It's sort of the lens through which they see everything. It's the way that they kind of assume things should be, or maybe without knowing it, they're even assuming that other people are using that function too, without knowing that it's a function. But that's kind of what everyone's doing. That's just the regular human experience. And so it's really rare actually to hear somebody talk about their driver function. That being said, most of what they say and the way that they say it and the way that they interpret their experiences is through that lens. But and if you sometimes I'll ask a question that is directly correlated to that driver function, and they'll usually take hold of that and have a lot to say about it. But again, it's not something that they feel the need to bring out and show you and make a big deal of, because it's just sort of everyday life for them, just like an old friend that they're very comfortable with.
Yeah, it's not a function that's doing cartwheels. It's not going,
Right.
look at me, look at me. I think the word that I heard you say was assumptive. It's just, this is just how things are, right? And so there's no, my observation has been that there's no like compensating energy behind it. There's no, I need to prove to you anything. There's no like feeling that this is something, even if a person doesn't understand type at all, they don't understand cognitive functions, because we do a lot of profiling sessions with people who don't know anything about type. So those are, in fact, some of the easiest people to profile, because they're just showing up as their authentic self. They're not sure, they're not trying to lead the profiler any specific direction. But even with somebody who knows type well or doesn't know type at all, there's a relaxed experience that a person has. It's like they just sort of rest into this this is their reality. It's like a fish in water. It is everything. So how would I even begin to describe it? And because it has that feeling about it, it doesn't feel loud. It feels more almost diffused in some ways.
Yes. And one thing that's really, really interesting to see is just the confidence that someone will have around it. And therefore, they can use that function over a lot of different contexts, in a lot of different ways, in a very natural way. And even being questioned on it doesn't seem to be so much of a challenge for them. I have a good friend who has his dominant process of introverted thinking or accuracy. And it's really interesting, because if you call him out and say, I think you're wrong about that, he sits up a little straighter and says, oh, how come? Tell me more about that. There's no defensiveness. It's just, oh, interesting. I might get to learn something new. I might get to have a more accurate understanding of this truth. And I find that as that particular function of accuracy goes down the stack, or moves to less developed or less mature places in the car model, there'll be more defensiveness, or more showing off, or more holding tightly to a certain idea that somebody has. But as a driver function, just seeing it in action in my friend, he's literally said, I don't mind if somebody tells me they think my idea is stupid. I just want to know why. Please explain it to me more. But that's not offensive to him, because TI as a driver for him is just such a confident process, and it becomes less confident as it moves throughout the car. And that's how it works, I think, generally with the functions.
Yeah, there's a lack of insecurity around it.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that fluency, you were talking about how because we use this dominant driver function in so many different areas of our lives, there's almost like a transferable skill quality to it. Like we're going to use our driver in so many different contexts, even contexts in which it's not the appropriate tool for the job.
Right.
That we gain all of this fluency and creativeness around it. And because we watch ourselves use it so often, I mean, even in an unconscious way, right? Like even if we didn't know what type was, all the skills and talents that are normally associated with that function, it's hard to penetrate our confidence around it, because we watch ourselves use it so often well, right? Like we build our own self-esteem around it. So when somebody pushes against it, it doesn't feel like, it feels more like you mentioned with the introverted thinking or accuracy. It's like, oh, I have an opportunity to refine this. Well, that's
Yes.
rare, right? It's rare when you have an opportunity to refine your dominant or driver. So those are almost always exciting moments.
Yeah, exactly. I remember as an NI driver using perspectives. I'm an INTJ, and I remember certain classes in college when I would latch onto a concept, and I could just feel myself sit forward and light up and feel like, oh, this is me, and someone is thinking like me. And when something was questioned, or when there was something a little bit new along a pattern that I already understood, it was very exciting. It wasn't going too deep or wasting time or, different. There are different perspectives on some of the professors that I had, but when I would run into another one of my kind, maybe, and I would have some of my assumptions around my driver questioned or need to use it in different ways to analyze things that I'd never analyzed before. It was so exciting, and but not exciting in a way that I felt like I needed to tell anybody. It's almost like I could feel this like quiet, happy glow inside, because I was in a flow state. I was just feeling like the best of myself.
Yeah, I think that's the relationship we have, is this quiet confidence. It's the best of myself. And so it's hard to derail that feeling. Yes. And so unless a person has had, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but like a really challenging environment, that has pushed against us and undermined it our entire lives, which is rare. It's rare when our lifestyle has undermined our dominant or driver our entire lives. Usually we have some space for it. And if we don't, we'll make a life change to make sure we have space for it. Like, I think one of the ways that a driver or dominant will show up for a person is that they will quietly make changes in their lives to accommodate for it. And it doesn't feel like a big fanfare thing. It doesn't feel like it's something that you have to blow a trumpet around. It's just like, well, this job made me feel better. How did it make you feel better? Well, a conversation will lead to, it allowed me to be my driver more often. And it won't be this like, well, I just had to make sure that the world saw this about me. It's just like, no, I just have quietly adjusted things to make sure that I can be in this process more and more and more. So I think the reality that is different than the theory is an assumption of loudness around the driver. But the reality against theory, the reality is that it's actually quiet. There's a quietness to it.
Yeah, I remember a profiling session that I watched recently with a student was profiling an ENTJ woman, and it was really interesting when she talked about her 10-year-old function. Hers would be sensation, and she would talk about it with a lot of excitement and a lot of energy. And then every time she would go back to talking about her extroverted thinking, which was her driver function, her voice would get kind of quiet. I'm like, oh yeah, I love that. I love being productive. Oh yeah, that's my life. That's my bread and butter. That's what I do. That's who I am. And it was so interesting to see that energy change. From the excited energy to the calm, almost like she was talking about, you hear like spouses at their 70th anniversary party, and they just talk with such fondness and quietness about each other. Like, oh yeah, this person. That's sort of what it sounded like every time she talked about her driver function. And I thought that was just an interesting difference, because as a beginning profiler, I would have listened to her loudness as she talked about her 10-year-old or sensation function and thought that's her driver. But no, her driver is the thing that she's the most comfortable with and that she does almost without thinking about it.
Yeah, this old comfortable relationship. Yes. I think you've used the phrase before, an old friend.
Yes.
Yeah. So unless you have more to say on the driver, let's move on to the co-pilot. The co-pilot being the function that people assume that we're going to be almost as good with as our driver. And you can see this because when somebody gets really into cognitive functions, one of the ways that the theory breaks down and people have to almost get over this assumption is that, like, take, for example, I'm an ENTP. I'm just an extroverted version of an NTP. And an INTP is just an introverted version of an NTP, that we're basically the same, but just one of us is louder and the other one is quieter. And so there's this assumption, or the theory is that our co-pilot or auxiliary function is basically the same as our dominant or driver. And we're going to have just as much skill in it, and we're going to have just as much of a comfortable relationship with it. And it's just a matter of trying to figure out, well, which one is the louder of the two, or not louder, assuming, of course, that the driver's the louder in the theory, but which one of these two is the slightly preferred. But again, the reality is very different than the theory.
Definitely. And actually, it almost feels like sometimes people need permission or need a little push to get into that co-pilot process, because they have a 10-year-old process that's always pulling it back a little bit. It's always trying to make it go to its opposite attitude. If you understand how polarities work, that the co-pilot and 10-year-old process are attached to each other. And so a lot of times when somebody goes into their co-pilot process, it feels like they're doing something that's a little bit hard for them, or something that they maybe there's a part of them that doesn't want to do it. But usually when they do actually get out there, or as it depends on the type, get inside and do that process, they can feel that it's good for them. It's rounding them out. It's developing something that maybe was a natural talent, but that they didn't necessarily naturally do without just life or somebody else or some kind of permission pushing them into doing that.
Yeah, there's not a lot of compensating energy here either.
Right.
That's probably why it feels like it's the same level of strength. But it's not that the person isn't. I think the lack of compensating energy is because I'm not insecure about my co-pilot auxiliary either, right? Like most people aren't insecure about it. But as you mentioned, the reality is it's an acknowledgement that I need to do that more.
Yes, for sure. And that there's another process waiting in the wings that sometimes pulls on that, or that they can see that there's another way of doing it. So, for example, as an INTJ, I have extroverted thinking as my co-pilot process, and it's very, usually very external, using resources, getting things done. But right behind that is a 10-year-old process of introverted feeling or authenticity that's always pulling back a little bit and saying, is that in line with your morals? Is that how you do you feel strongly enough about this thing to be willing to put yourself out there in the extroverted world and do that thing? So it's like there's kind of like a little tiny battle that's going on inside. And so it's like I can see both sides of it. I can see both sides of the coin. I can see both options or decisions that I could make, and then I have to decide which one to do. And so sometimes the co-pilot process wins out, and sometimes it doesn't. And so it isn't that same natural relationship as I have with my driver function. And that's generally how I see it working in other people.
Right. So it's not insecure, but it's also not assumptive.
Right.
Yeah. It's this sense that like I have a push-pull relationship with it, and when I let it win, it usually works out for me, but I don't always let it win.
That's right. And it's deliberate when I choose to use it, especially at the start, as you're developing it. And the start for you might be in your childhood. You might be doing it throughout your life, but it definitely is. It's a decision. It's something that doesn't just happen unconsciously. It's something that, it's not so much that old friend, obvious kind of relationship for you.
Right. And I've noticed, in fact, we were just having a conversation about this, Joel, Melissa, and I. We were just having a conversation before the podcast about when circumstances or people keep us from being able to be in our co-pilot, we'll get real salty. We'll get really frustrated.
Definitely.
But when we choose not to do it, that's fine, right? We want the option available. And I think what ends up happening, at least for me, is when I feel like circumstances or a person or whatever is keeping me from that co-pilot or auxiliary function, one of the reasons why I'm frustrated is because I instinctively know that they're keeping me from being my best self. Versus the driver, which I literally will not allow anybody to keep me from it. It's almost like we hand ourselves over to the letting things sabotage our co-pilot a little bit more. We're more vulnerable to it being sabotaged or undermined. And it takes a little longer for us to register it. But once we realize that that's what's going on, we get really frustrated. Whereas our driver, because we're going to be in it all the time, it's like we immediately register when the world is trying to keep us from that. We immediately know. And we have an immediate response, which is like, no, I'm going to do this thing. Like, you cannot stop me. With the co-pilot or auxiliary, we let people do that to us, or sometimes we let ourselves sabotage it, and then it's an awareness over time, and then suddenly, no, I've got to be able to do that. Does that make sense, by the way?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. And sometimes I think it's other people that keeps us from using it. Sometimes it's ourselves, and sometimes it's just generally fear. It's just that little bit of anxiety, like, I don't want to go out and explore something new, or I don't want to put myself out there, or I'm afraid people will reject me, or, there's just that little, it's not always a strong fear, but it's like a little whisper And I think that's one of the reasons that Personality Hacker, we encourage people to develop that co-pilot process, is just giving a little more weight or a little more permission. Like, no, this is a good part of you. And usually when you explain the co-pilot to someone and give them that little nudge to use it, they usually can tell it is going to be good. Usually somebody says, yeah, you're right, I could do that more. Or, yeah, it feels kind of good. I feel like a little lift inside to think, yeah, I can do that thing. And on the other hand, times when maybe we misprofile somebody, or we're trying out a co-pilot, we're trying on a type and that type isn't our type, and we're trying to go to the co-pilot, you can feel really just beyond uncomfortable. It's not just that little bit of discomfort. It's like, like a depression or a sadness or a terror even of using a function that doesn't really belong in that particular spot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so earlier we talked about how it's not insecurity, but you just mentioned the word fear. And I think that that's a really good distinction to make between like what's really going on with the co-pilot or auxiliary function. Insecurity is like, I don't know if I'll be able to, I don't know if I'll be able to do this well. It's not insecure in that way. It's not a lack of self-confidence around it. I think the fear you're talking about is like all the implications, right?
Absolutely.
Like if I start doing this, I instinctively know that my whole life will change. I instinctively know I'm going to have to start honoring this thing now. I'm going to have to start doing things a different way. And am I ready for that? Am I ready for everything to change if I'm doing this well?
Yeah, because it is such a different, the co-pilot directs you, right? That's telling the driver, giving the driver input for where to go. So you are going to end up someplace different if you're listening to that co-pilot process.
Right. And that new place, it's not like I don't have the facility in my co-pilot. Like, it's not like my co-pilot will get overwhelmed. It's, am I as a person ready for these changes? Right. And so then it forces us out of our comfort zone, which has all sorts of implications after that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like true growth. It's like all the fear that comes around growth. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about loudness, though. We've always talked about the driver. It's kind of like an old friend. We don't seem to boast or get loud about it. The co-pilot, it's this weird push-pull relationship with. It's, kind of shows up in a very different way. But we get over to the 10-year-old or tertiary, and now this is where we're starting to see some loudness, some boisterousness, some attempt to prove its value to other people. This is what tends to show up for profilees in a session.
Yeah. So the theory would be, if everything was beautifully elegant, we'd be the best at our driver. We'd be slightly less sophisticated, but still very good with our co-pilot. And our 10-year-old or tertiary would be like slightly less advanced, but it would still be, I think the theory starts to favor people's biases, and people's biases are that I'm great at my 10-year-old or tertiary. And so then that bleeds into theory. And so it's like, no, we're actually pretty good at our tertiary function. It's really supportive. But what's the reality of the situation?
I think for the 10-year-old, it's tricky because it, just like a real 10-year-old in real life, there might be areas of great supportiveness and great sophistication. But that doesn't mean it's sophisticated across the board. That doesn't mean it's where you want to get the advice for where to drive your car. But it often does show up in times of play and intimacy. We teach that, and I think a lot of times what comes to our minds when somebody in a profiling context, for example, or just in conversation, is we want to talk about those things. It's fun to talk about the things that we do on vacation, or when we had some time off, or when we did something that we were really proud of and we felt really good about. So that's a lot of times the function that comes out in those times. And so it can appear a lot more robust than maybe it actually is.
Yeah, and I keep using the word overcompensating, and that the driver and the co-pilot are not, but that's because in contrast to the 10-year-old or tertiary, like that is an overcompensating energy. That energy gets loud because it is insecure. There's an insecurity that we have around it, but we don't want to see ourselves that way. We want to see ourselves as having a really good handle on it. And so that's when we start getting not just loud because we enjoy it. I mean, I think that's a big piece of it too. But we get loud because we're trying to kind of convince ourselves and other people that we're better at it than maybe we actually are.
Yeah. And then it can be really destabilizing maybe if somebody does say something that makes us feel defensive in that area. It can be a more deep defensiveness, maybe then would come up with a different function.
But at the same time, like you mentioned, there's a part of us that really enjoys it too. Like I think that we have a love-hate relationship with our 10-year-old or tertiary. Like there's some areas that we love it, and the areas that strike us personally, because of course every function does a lot of different things, right? Like, and not every single person has the same relationship to that function. Like my 10-year-old or tertiary function is extroverted feeling or harmony. There are elements of extroverted feeling or harmony that I absolutely adore and love, and I've put concentrated effort, not just to developing it, but like just being in it as much as I can because I enjoy it so much. And then at the same time, there are components to this function that I can't stand. And when the world forces me to be responsible in those ways, then I push it away. I go, oh, that's just something I don't want to look at all. Whereas I've seen other ETPs have the same dynamic, but in reverse. The things I love about it, they can't stand. And the things I can't stand, they love. And so we're not all going to have the same relationship with those specific functions and those specific parts. But the thing that is predictable is the love-hate, right? Like there's going to be some areas, and then the areas that we love, we're going to really puff up. We're going to be like, see, this is why I'm so awesome at it. And when somebody goes, yeah, but what about this part of that function? You're like, yeah, that's not important, right? Like that's not a thing. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I do think, I also think there's an element sometimes that comes with the 10-year-old of being judgy of other people who are or aren't using that process. And of course that can happen with any cognitive function, but it seems like that's the one that comes out more often or more in a stronger way. I know that if I was going to get into an argument with someone with TI as a driver or TI as a 10-year-old, I'd pick the driver anytime, because having a secure function that you don't feel like you need to defend, that you don't hold on to too tightly or too loosely, that's a lot more comfortable. But, you know, as a 10-year-old TI, for example, this could be any function in this position, but people tend to really hold on tightly and to sometimes judge other people who aren't doing this thing right. So it can be a little bit sticky there.
We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show. Two ways I like to look at this. The first way is I can get the job, but can I do the job mentality? Meaning that I think all of our 10-year-olds, we tend to seek outlets for them, roles in companies or communities or families or whatever for this to come out. But the moment we get the role that this drove us toward, now all of a sudden we're defensive about it because we're like, I don't know if I'm that good at it. But now we're surrounded by people that do this thing really well because that was the role that was drawing us, right? Like for myself, as an effectiveness user, maybe I am driven toward a career path that is around other effectiveness users that are doing it really well. So now I'm in this role that I got, and now I feel insecure because I'm surrounded by people that do this excellently. And so now I've got to defend it. And then the next thing happens, which is I attempt to revert, like gerrymander the rules of effectiveness to make it onto my turf so I can be excellent at it. So I'm really defensive about it in that way too. You mentioned like you wouldn't want to get into an argument with an IFJ. How many IFJs end up like in academia or something, you know, that really heavy thinking roles because they have enough introverted thinking to get the job, but they get there, they're around other academics, and now they feel like, wait, do I really have what it takes in this space? And that can create some defensiveness and some, you know, zooming in on the details when they don't matter, et cetera, like this. And it just reinforces the insecurity, reinforces the defensiveness. And so it's this endless cycle now.
Yeah, so we're mixing our terms a lot. So for anybody who's relatively new, Melissa was in TI. She was talking about introverted thinking or accuracy. Joel was just mentioning effectiveness. That's extroverted thinking or effectiveness. So I just want to make sure for anybody who's
good job. This is what I usually do.
I know.
You're doing it for me. This is fantastic.
I know, because people are at varying levels. Yeah, no, I just to piggyback on what you both were saying, I think career choice, we've talked to Dr. Dario Nardi a lot about brain scans and what shows up and is obvious in different personality types. And after the age of about 25, it seems that career path and career choice really alters the brain, like sort of the brain imaging that comes out in people's personality types. And career choice is going to be what you're choosing to use your brain wattage on for 40 hours a week, ostensibly, sometimes more or less, but and that will pull on different parts of your cognition, right? Like, what if you choose something that requires a lot of your 10-year-old or tertiary function? That's going to probably be more sophisticated. It's going to be a little stronger. You're probably going to have less insecurity over time as you're using it and it's showing up, and you have more skill development. And it's going to be in the context of your career, right? Like that, how your career is telling you to use it, that's going to be where the highest fluency is. But again, all of these functions do a lot of different things. So a person who has your 10-year-old or tertiary as their dominant or driver, even if they don't have as much skill development in a specific way, like maybe your career is requiring it. We talked about ENFPs being engineers in previous podcasts. Sometimes if you're an ENFP that's an engineer, you've been pulling on your extroverted thinking or effectiveness a lot, specifically in the context of your career. But you're still not going to have the same transferable fluency as somebody who has that as a dominant or a driver. They're still going to have more relaxed relationship with it. They're going to be using it in all sorts of different contexts. Whereas that specific context, you might actually in that way outclass them because you've been required to build that specific muscle. But they're still going to have overall flexibility. And you're still going to feel that. You're still going to experience that when you're around them, and you're still going to have that compensating energy, right? That like, no, I'm good at this too. It's almost like a proof, right? And so it's almost impossible to let go of that energy. And by the way, I think that energy is a part of what propels and drives us as people. And I think in some ways we don't want to lose that energy. We kind of want that part of us, not insecurity specifically, but the drive to do better in ways that we can instinctively feel are not our natural talent. Does that gel? Does that make sense?
Oh, definitely. And just another point I was going to bring up about that 10-year-old function is that usually people have words for it. They can explain it and they can talk about it with somebody else. And it's almost like they're more shared words about it. So if I talk with my husband, who's an ESFJ, and he has exploration or extroverted intuition as his 10-year-old, if I talk to him about creativity, he lights up and sits forward and says, "Oh, I love doing creative things." He is very excited about it. If I talk to him about his social skills, his people skills, he sort of stays calm and just looks at me like, "Oh, yeah, isn't that how we should all treat people? Isn't that what we should all do? That's just how you treat people, right?" But again, he'll just get all excited. It's like we have words for our 10-year-old function. Usually we can talk about it. And a lot of times when we try to find words for somebody's driver function, they might not latch onto it right away because again, it is so nuanced. There is so much to it. It can go across such a broad spectrum of experiences and circumstances that it's hard to define it or pin it down with just a couple of words. But the 10-year-old's a lot easier to do that with.
Yeah, I've noticed that ESJs, maybe more so ESFJs than ESTJs, but I've seen this with both. They'll really identify as being a weirdo, right? Oh yeah, I'm a total weirdo, right? Whereas a lot of ENPs are like trying to sort of downplay that part of them. Like, I don't really want to be called a weirdo because I'm like, yeah, I know. I know. It's like, it's something that I can't do anything about at this point. And because it's been so much a part of my life, I've seen both the good and the bad of it. And I've dealt with the entire technical spectrum of being a weirdo, that it's one of those things where I'm like, I don't really want to go on and on about how much of a weirdo I am. But I'll notice somebody who's using extroverted intuition or exploration as a 10-year-old or tertiary will go on and on about how much of a weirdo they are.
Absolutely. And that's another thing about the driver, especially as we start moving toward the 3-year-old. It's another thing about the driver is that if it is something that we've been using naturally and easily and with kind of a shoulder shrug kind of energy, like, of course I do this, our entire lives, then we are going to have had experiences with the downsides of it too, with the times when it isn't the right tool. You know, for me, it's the times when I'm not sitting in that college classroom learning about a deep theory or connection in literature, when I'm in a PE class, right? You can see usually the places that you have a very strong deficit or weakness around that driver process because you're not using its opposite function. And a lot of times with a 10-year-old, that doesn't come up as much. It's just more enthusiastic, like, oh, no, like overconfidence, as opposed to what it would be like if it was the driver.
There is almost a shelter from the storm relationship we have with that 10-year-old or tertiary. It's a place we go to in some ways almost as our comfort, right? And so because of that, it's hard for us to see it in a negative light unless we're in a situation that's requiring us to pull on an element of it that we haven't really done very much work on. So in those moments, it's the opposite of a comfort. In the moments when we're thrown into a situation that would require us to have the same level of fluency with that function that somebody who has it as a driver or co-pilot, those are the moments in which we have like a very push away relationship. It's very deeply uncomfortable. But when it's a moment that we that we have done some work around, it's a total comfort zone for us. So it's hard for us to acknowledge any of the downsides of our 10-year-old or tertiary because what we tend to highlight in our mind are those comfort zone moments.
Right. And then when we get defensive, by definition, we're focused on defending that process. So we're not looking at the process as we defend it. We're looking at the person who maybe made an accusation or the circumstance in our life that tried to, take us out of a place that we wanted to be. And so, yeah, it definitely, we do fail to see a lot of times the downsides or our own deficit in that area.
Mm-hmm. And so there's this sense that as the theory, I think in a lot of people's minds is that as you go down this stack, then you're going to have more consciousness at the top and less at the bottom, right? And so you'd have the most consciousness with your driver or dominant. You'd have slightly less consciousness with your co-pilot or auxiliary, and then slightly less with your 10-year-old tertiary, and finally the least amount of consciousness with your 3-year-old or inferior. But the reality is different. We actually have the most consciousness, even if we don't know type, even if we don't know anything about functions or whatever, we have a more conscious relationship with that polarity of the co-pilot and 10-year-old or the auxiliary and tertiary. That seems to occupy a lot of our conscious awareness, is that struggle back and forth and the choices we've made. And maybe sometimes when we've allowed the 10-year-old to win out over the co-pilot, even if it's just in our life stories, even if it's just like, I had this opportunity and I didn't take it and I probably should have. And sometimes I regret that. And you're talking to an INP, right? Like, I chose my comfort zone and I should have been, and then they'll have another story. It's like, yeah, but then I totally took a chance and then it turned out for me and blah, blah, blah. Like, our life stories oftentimes are us contending with these two parts of who we are, whereas our driver and our 3-year-old doesn't seem to have a lot of consciousness at all. It's just like, yeah, that's just whatever that's about. And so the theory, again, kind of clashes with the reality.
Definitely. Because there always is that little bit of push and a pull with the co-pilot and the 10-year-old process. They're close together in the car. And so it can be hit or miss which one we call upon. As a driver process, are we going to go to the co-pilot or sometimes are we going to listen to the 10-year-old? And with the driver and the 3-year-old, there's a lot more distance there. I think there's a lot less of a push and a pull. It's like the driver's in charge most of the time.
So let's go over to the 3-year-old inferior process to finish this off. The theory is that we all hate this aspect of ourselves. We never want to do this. We have zero skill. We're so blind to it that we can't overcome it. I mean, I remember seeing a comment, I think under one of our YouTube videos, asking like me and Antonia, how do you both have intimacy in your life as a couple? We all know that introverted sensing or memory, the function you both use as an inferior process, prohibits both of you from being able to build intimacy with another person. First of all, that's completely crazy to think that introverted sensing at the inferior process or introverted sensing is the only place we build intimacy. But what I took from that, regardless of the data, is that this oversimplified view of what that 3-year-old or inferior means to someone. This person has a very overgeneralized vision for that. And I think we all, in the theory, sometimes have this. Like, well, this is your inferior. Melissa, as an INTJ, extroverted sensing or sensations, you're inferior. So you probably are just walking into walls. If you hold a knife, a sharp knife or object, you're probably cutting yourself or others randomly, all the time. You can barely function in the world. Sometimes we have this view of the 3-year-old or inferior, like it's this latent part of us that we just can't access. We can't get to it. It just trips us up all the time. But in reality, this isn't necessarily how this shows up in profiling.
Yeah, and actually, it's pretty unusual for it to show up that way. A lot of times it can show up, especially if you're talking to somebody about themselves. The times when they go to that 3-year-old process, they've had to work hard. They've had to work for it. And so they are going to talk about it, and it's going to be a very big deal to them usually. And maybe even kind of an area, and probably well-deserved, of well-deserved pride, that they're proud of what they've done in that area. And we've talked about this before, but as I was a dancer growing up, I always took dance lessons. I loved it. And in college, I was on a dance team that toured around the world and was a very elite. It was very, very hard to get on it. And I was able to do that. Now, as I was learning the steps and as I was learning the choreography, I was definitely using a different part of my brain than a lot of the people in that room, a lot of the other people on my team who would see a step and just quickly pick it up. And I was breaking it down and analyzing and looking at patterns and looking at other countries that use the same step. I was doing international, like folk dancing. And I was learning using a lot of my driver process too, I think. But still, I was able to achieve that status on that team. And for me, that's always something that, if I didn't know anything about type and somebody said, oh yeah, you're always walking to walls or cutting yourself or, all the things that Joel just said, I would immediately go to, no, sir, because I was on this folk dance team in college, and that would be the thing that came up. If I tried to expand that though, and if the person went on to ask me, and also in PE class growing up, were you always one of the best ones? There's no way that wouldn't be true. And also, are you generally very aware of your environment? That wouldn't be true. So there's one area that I am, developed some achievement in using my 3-year-old function, and I'm very proud of it and very excited about it. But gosh, that doesn't go across the board for sure.
But there's a reason for the theoretical component, though, which is that, and I've even said this in many times in profiler training, if you get a really solid description of your inferior function and all the ways that it shows up, oftentimes you'll have almost like an ick about that, because you're not just talking about components of it, like ways it can manifest, ways it can show up. You're talking about the philosophy of it. And oftentimes the philosophy of that inferior function is one that you are not a fan of, right? Like, to me, introverted sensing or memory, if somebody talks about, sort of little quirky things, like a quirky relationship I have with a souvenir or totem from my past, right? We were talking about this on Twitter recently, that people who use introverted sensing or memory as an inferior or 3-year-old function will have all these little weird things that come up. And one of the ways that I realize mine does is that I have a cup. I have a specific coffee mug that I want to be using every single day. And if it ever broke, I'm not sure what I would do.
It did break.
It did break, and I glued it back together.
Yeah, we ordered really expensive glue to get it put back together.
That's right, because I have to have my cup, right? That's very introverted sensing, and I would acknowledge,
it's sitting right behind you, actually.
It is, actually. It's my cup.
Carries it everywhere with her.
It's such a weird little quirky thing. And I don't have any variants in my coffee mugs. I have to have that cup, and I drink my coffee out of it, my tea. So there are components of it that are very associated with me. But if you talk about the philosophy of introverted sensing or memory, you have to experience things more than once in order to really get used to them. It takes a long timeline in order to adjust and acclimate. It has a tendency to be more sort of protocol oriented and a little more safety oriented. I'm like, oh, no. I have like a definitive push away from that. And so it's not the people who are using it, it's the philosophy of the function that I want to push away. So there's a reason why we get this sense that like, oh, we don't like our inferior at all. But that's because our dominant or driver it has an instinct to push away from the more holistic component of its opposite. It doesn't want to be, sort of almost like sabotaged by it. It doesn't want to have to live in that world because it's the polarity opposite. But that doesn't mean it's not constantly and perpetually influenced by it. It doesn't mean that it's not like that part of us. We always talk about how it's sort of whispering in your ear. There's a lot of influence we get that from that function that is very definitively and distinctly part of that 3-year-old or inferior. And there's parts of it that make our heart sing. Like for you, Melissa, it was dance. Your extroverted sensing or sensation loved the dance portion. And so you put yourself whole hog into it. You learned it in college, you taught it, you went on tour around it. That was a big deal for you. But probably not the entire philosophy of extroverted sensing or sensation.
No.
Yeah. So like when you talk to people who have this, like that sort of, this is how reality works and it's very like obvious in front of you and it is what it is and all of those components, my guess is that you have a different relationship with that than you do with dance.
Definitely. And even with the dance, it's interesting. It's like, I do the extroverted sensing part of it. I love it so much, but it doesn't take long for me to start talking about, well, but why did people from Bulgaria dance the way that they danced? Why did they lift their knees up so high? I take it to my driver function, and that's part of why I love it. And I think about how the music ties into the dance and what it means for the people. And so I think because that driver and 3-year-old function for any of us are in the same, they're doing the same thing. They're either both judging functions or they're both perceiving functions. And so I think a lot of times we can start using one end of that function or one side of that polarity and then take it to the other. I look at I have a teenage daughter who's an ENFP, and she has been so excited about knitting lately. And when she first picked up a couple of knitting needles, I thought, okay, this will last about 5 minutes. But no, she actually got out the books, looked at the diagram. And I mean, I think it's a very introverted sensing thing that there's a pattern and steps and a recipe and ways to do it, that you need to do it this way or it isn't going to work. She got very good at following those patterns, and she's, had some amazing creations, but the longer she does it, the less she follows those patterns. And the more now she goes straight back up to her exploration, and she's making all kinds of interesting stuffed animals and starting projects that she doesn't finish at all, but just exploring the different ways to do it and getting very excited about it. But I think just because they're, it's in the same areas, they're perceiving functions. It's how she learns. And so she got good at the introverted sensing, but then she just went straight back up to her driver as soon as she could with those projects.
I think there's also a component here about one-sidedness. And I think that one of the challenges with that 3-year-old or inferior, I mean, we all have a varied relationship with some of these functions depending upon our experiences. And like we're talking about trends, not absolutes or rules. So it's important to remember that too. But in profiling, these are the relationships we see the most often, right? Having done hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of profiling sessions, in aggregate, this is the general sentiment. That said, there's also a piece about whether or not the person has a more one-sided relationship to their personality type or less one-sided. So the more one-sided you are, the more you're going to sort of lock into that driver and co-pilot, particularly the driver. You might not have a lot of variance or relationship with your 3-year-old or inferior. And this is probably part of the reason why some of the theory shows up the way it does, is because we tend to study the more obvious examples of type. We tend to study the people who are like out loud versions, and we miss some of the subtleties of people who have trained themselves or been trained out of one-sidedness. So the 3-year-old or inferior function relationship sometimes is less predictable than the rest. There's an unpredictableness to how we engage with it. I think the only really predictable component is that if we're forced to be in it too long, we'll get depressed. That's really what it comes down to. And so if our lifestyle forces us to be there for too long, our driver just cannot handle it. And it just gets really dysthymic. But with the exception of our environment enforcing us to be there all the time, if we have the luxury of choice And if we also have some training around it, we can be there for, as long as we need to be sometimes. Like I have these really long stints of introverted sensing or memory time periods where I'm just comfort seeking like crazy. I think the other thing is that that's predictable is that we're just never going to use it with the same fluency. We're never going to have the same range. In fact, we're going to have very limited range when we go there. And we're going to oftentimes experience challenges when the world requires us to be there in a more broad range, and we just can't show up in that way.
Again, just like with the 10-year-old or tertiary, I think we try to gerrymander it onto our turf often. So somebody that has this as inferior, they might try to use the black and white thinking of this function because it's their 3-year-old and say everybody should be thinking about it as simply as I am because that's what I can handle. And I think that we tend to speak in those terms or project that outward, right? Like maybe an ETJ, somebody that uses effectiveness or extroverted thinking as a driver, they might oversimplify ethics or morality down to what makes sense to them of their introverted feeling, but it's very simplified. It's very black and white. It's very on-off binary. And they want everyone else to meet them on that turf because that's as much as they can handle. That's just an example. I'm not trying to pick on ETJs. I think we all tend to do that.
Yeah. And I think it can be very, very black and white. And maybe even like a spike of being good in one area and then a total deficit, not even realizing that the rest of the area even exists, not even realizing that there's more to do there. I was recently talking to an INFJ that I profiled, and he can see all of his functions very easily, but he has a very hard time seeing his sensation or extroverted sensing 3-year-old process. And I think part of that could be just he's not seeing it. He's not seeing all of the things that he might be missing. It's more just like absent from his mind. So it's not that he's running into walls and, cutting his finger when he tries to chop the vegetables. It's more just that there's a whole world of experiences that he's insulating himself from by being more in his driver. And generally that's a very, healthy thing to do is be using our driver, but there might be a whole realm of experiences that he's not having because he doesn't have a lot of awareness around that 3-year-old.
Well, and I think one of the reasons why every once in a while somebody will think that their inferior 3-year-old function is higher up in their stack than it really is because every time they've used it or possibly used it well, it's memorable. Whereas every time you use your dominant or driver, it's like, yeah, whatever that is, It's not noteworthy because we're using it like 200 times a day. But every time we use our 3-year-old or inferior, it can be like a big deal. And so, and it's just so obvious to us that sometimes we associate with our 3-year-old or inferior, kind of similar to the 10-year-old or tertiary. Every time we use it and use it well, it's so noteworthy that it becomes really obvious to us. And we'll attach because we're doing this thing and we're like, see, I'm really good at it. I'm really awesome. Did you see that one time? Completely undermining how amazing we are at our driver and all the things it brings, because that to us individually is mundane.
That's right. And I think also just changing lanes. A lot of times when we get into our 3-year-old function, a 3-year-old process, we can kind of go headlong, like all into it for that time, and then being jarred out of it or being asked to be a little more flexible in the way that we use it can feel like, no, I can't do that. Where with our driver function, it's just so much more fluent and flexible, and you don't have that challenge in changing lanes when you need to. But with a 3-year-old, it's so difficult.
So of course, these are the things that have come up for us while we're doing profiling sessions. And there's again, we talked about the theory versus the reality. When you're doing self-profiling, like you, the listener, maybe I'm assuming that you're taking the context and applying it to yourself and what you know about your functions and your type, sort of understanding yourself in all of this, because there might be some helpfulness there just in growth and development. You might believe that you don't have to have any relationship with your 3-year-old inferior, and this might give you more of an idea of how you're individually using it, maybe some more opportunities around how you can integrate this part in your life. And your 10-year-old or tertiary, are you clinging onto it too tightly and all of the things it brings to you? And is there maybe a more relaxed relationship you can have with it and hand a little bit more sovereignty up to your co-pilot or auxiliary? I want to talk a little bit about some of the anomalies to all of this, because again, these are not rules, they're trends that we've seen. But one of the things that I've seen as an anomaly to these relationships is time period of life. And you even mentioned this, Melissa, in a conversation we were having before, that in certain time periods of life, some of these trends, quote unquote, go out the window.
Definitely. I think, I have 4 children who are they're teenagers, and they've been brought up understanding a lot about typology. This very interesting that when I ask them to tell me about themselves, or when they're, a lot of times I will ask them profiling questions just to try them out. And it's so frequent that they answer from their 10-year-old process. My ENTP son, who is 14, and he's using extroverted feeling as a 10-year-old, when I asked him, hey, so what's your role in a group usually, do you think? He immediately said, oh, just trying to glue everybody together. Just trying to help everybody come together. And as his mother, as someone who's seen him in groups, I would say, no, it's not. You're always stirring things up. You're always, ribbing somebody or getting somebody, like doing something silly to get somebody else in trouble, getting them to act out a little bit. But for him, he sees himself as the glue in the group, the person doing the harmony process, or his 10-year-old process. And that's just one example, but I've seen it with all of them, and with many of us too, especially as we're a little less mature or still developing. Again, I think that 10-year-old comes out quite strongly. And then, but in actually healthy ways, I've seen the lower functions come out in older people, in very healthy ways. A lot of times when I talk to somebody who's in their 60s or even a little bit older, sometimes they will talk with a lot of love and a lot of humility around that 3-year-old process. And humility, I think, is a great way to think of it, because they've had all of their lives it's not the place that they normally naturally go, but it's like something has been broken down maybe a little later in life, where they've realized, oh, this is actually valuable. This is an important process. So I've seen some great examples of that too.
I've also seen when a person has maybe some trauma or some healing work that they need to do, or maybe it's just general growth work. I've noticed particularly like extroverts will go to a very introverted place, and they can be visiting either their co-pilot, auxiliary, or their 3-year-old inferior, depending upon maybe where the trauma lives. And I've seen, like, for myself as an ENTP, I went through a time period where, I just didn't want to see another human being for a really long time. I had a lot of introverted thinking work to do. I had to be in my co-pilot a lot. That threw me into my 3-year-old inferior, and I was doing a lot of work there too. And so there was a time period where I would not have, had I not known type, I would have not identified as an extrovert at all. I would have thought of myself as being very introverted, because during that time period, I needed to do that for my own healing work. I had a lot of trauma to get through. I had a lot of figuring out who I was. And so I think during certain time periods, if we are introduced to type during certain time periods, we will not identify maybe with what actually is our best fit type, because in that moment, it doesn't serve us to be that way. It serves us to be almost the opposite of what we normally are.
I think so. What I hear you saying, and I'll add to it, age, we tend to develop functions based on certain aspects of our age and life cycle, the season of our life. And also there's other factors that might pull upon some of our functions. Maybe we get a new job and now we have to activate and use a function we didn't use before, or we get a new relationship and we're using a function maybe more than we have in the past. And so, in a profiling session or talking to somebody, the time of life as their age might be important, but also to factor in what's showing up based on what they're focused on right now in their life. Because our attention is tuned to something that we're pulling on part of our personality for, that again, I think can give a more realistic read rather than the theory, oh, this is how this is actually showing up for this person because they're using it now, whereas they weren't before. So this can be something else I think you got to factor into the profiling.
I've seen both ETJs and ITJs, or at least I've had conversations and coached people of these two types, both of them that will say that they were an intense extroverted thinking or effectiveness time period in their life and they got super burned out. And for an ETJ, that might be one-sidedness. They got to a point where they discovered the end of the effectiveness of being so one-sided, and they now really understood the importance of going to a more introverted space. Sometimes that's their co-pilot or auxiliary of introverted intuition, or sometimes it's the 3-year-old of needing to be an introverted feeling or authenticity. But whatever it is, they had a moment of burnout. I've seen that in ITJs as well. And the ETJ might at that time period think, well, I'm an introvert because I got burned out. For ITJs, I've seen them hit the end of that and go, I think I've hit, it's more like I've hit the limit of my growth and development in my auxiliary co-pilot, and now it's time for me to get to my 10-year-old or tertiary. Now I need to sort of weave in that part of me again, because I was over relying on it before. I pushed it away. I got super in my co-pilot auxiliary, and now I need to reintroduce that part of who I am. So in both cases, they were like, I'm pretty sure I'm an introvert. The ITJ was accurate. The ETJ was not, right? But they both had almost the exact same experience. It's just if you really kind of pop the hood open, they had to go to a different place. And where they went to after that for rest was a different place. For the ETJ, they had to go to their co-pilot or 3-year-old for rest. For the ITJ, they had to go to their 10-year-old or tertiary for rest. And so it's like a totally different dynamic with the exact same experiences. And so depending upon what you're going through right now, it's not necessarily the time of life that should be looked at. It's where do I have to go next? What's the next port of call that will be good for me or healthy for me? Where do I need to head next in order to get myself back, right? For me as an ETP, I needed to go to that introverted thinking or accuracy place. I had to go there intensely for a long time. But I wasn't in a place where now I needed to get back into exploration or extroverted intuition. I never left that place. That was still always a part of who I was. Everything was still being filtered there. What I needed to do was reinsert extroverted feeling or harmony. I was getting a little too imbalanced. And one of the reasons why I did that is because I had given over too much power to extroverted feeling or harmony before. So it was like, okay, now I need to reacquaint myself with the benefits of that function. But I'd never left extroverted intuition, right? So it wasn't like I was like suddenly an INTP. It was that I just needed to be in my auxiliary co-pilot more. So one of the reasons why sometimes this can be challenging in profiling is because you kind of have to juggle all these different balls. You can't just be looking for functions. You've also got to be looking for placement, time of life, what their experiences are. You need to really listen to their stories, their relationships, how things have been as a through line, not just in that moment, but the whole time period of their life, how things were before, how they feel, where they show up as their best, right? Not just like, oh, I just heard introverted intuition, that must be it, right? It's like, okay, but what's the relationship with introverted intuition? Is it predictable, right? Is it like part of a whole life story? Or is it just one moment I heard one thing, so I'm now placing it on the map?
Yeah, absolutely. And it can be such a challenge to determine, because you are taking all of these things into account. But one of the things that has really helped me is just looking at what's really obvious to them and what is very, very baffling or bewildering, or life problems that they just keep encountering over and over. A lot of times those will come from their 3-year-old, right? And a lot of times they won't say these things directly. They won't say, the thing that I'm good at that other people don't seem to notice is, they might not say that, but it's woven into the way they're talking. It's woven into the stories that they're telling. And then the moment, maybe the end of the story, when they say, and that's why this thing happened, and that was really hard to deal with, that could be something from their 3-year-old. So a lot of times just trying to put it into context of somebody's life. You might not get the actual words where they're directly telling you. You might need to read between the lines a little bit if you're the one doing the profiling. And if you're trying to analyze it in your own self, it's the same thing. I think it's just trying to put it into context of your entire life, not just the moment that you're in.
I think that's one of the things I've appreciated the most about this process of implementing profiling. And you can do it even if you're not somebody who's an official profiler. You can do it as somebody who's just a type enthusiast. But the real conversations you have with people teach you so much about how this shows up in reality. Like the real benefit of profiling is that I've got to hear so many people's stories. I've got to hear how type has influenced them and all the different ways that they show up. And I've been really grateful to be able to have a richer experience of understanding personality type. Not just my own growth path. I mean, you can use type in that way too. Obviously, it's very powerful. But what I've really appreciated about going through this process is just these conversations with people and really seeing how it shows up for them, seeing that there's a lot of texture here. And things aren't just always so there are certain things that are predictable, but there are a lot of things that you have to, sort of understand that there's some nuance here. There's some art involved. And I've been grateful for profiling for handing me that broader understanding.
So what do you think? You've been listening along. You're the fourth person in this conversation, but you haven't had a microphone like myself, Antonia, and Melissa, but we want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this episode. Share your questions, comments, or more importantly, your story. Where have you maybe seen some of these things come up in your life? Maybe you've observed them in others. What have you taken away from this conversation we've had today that you might want to apply to your life particularly? So come on over and make your voice heard.
Melissa, thank you so much for joining us today as a co-host. We really appreciate it, for lending your expertise and your perspectives on how this all shows up. I just really appreciate you giving us your time.
Oh, I had a great time.
If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating and review on iTunes, it helps us out a lot. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. And if you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on not iTunes, on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. And of course, we have an entire suite of programs that are personal growth oriented through the lens of personality type. So if that sounds interesting to you, head over to personalityhacker.com and under I think it's catalog, right? Or is it products?
One of the two.
One of the two. Go check out our suite of programs and see if there's one that's right for you.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Melissa Harris.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.